Okay, so my name is Mike Tresca. I am your host of the CAR-PGA. I'm also the CAR-PGA committee chair. I'm very excited to have Ben Riggs with us today. We'll talk to him in a moment about his new book, upcoming book, actually. I'm acting like it's out, but it's not out yet, even though I've seen it everywhere, advertised everywhere. So, but a few housekeeping things before we get started. There's a couple things we wanted to discuss just really quickly. So again, discuss is relative. This is more because it's asynchronous and this is a recording, but I do want to make sure we bring them up. So we want to welcome Wolf James Roby, who just joined the CAR-PGA. We're always excited to welcome new members. He's pursuing a dissertation topic on cooperative gaming. So welcome, Wolf. One of the things that's come up is our 501c status. So the CAR-PGA is not 501c. It hasn't needed to be in the past. But it has come up, and because we are with our sister organization run by one of our board members, Hawk Robinson, he leads RPG Research, which is 501c incorporated. We have floated the potential possibility of basically connecting with that organization to give us the 501c status, and then I would probably me. We're not sure exactly who would be on the RPG Research board. So you'll hear more about that in email. In our monthly newsletter, but I wanted to bring it up as a possibility. It is by no means set, and if you feel strongly one way or the other, we'd love to hear from you. But that's just something we wanted to float because it is a topic of discussion. It's important. 501c brings challenges and advantages. I have run and do run 501cs in other places, and it's not a small amount of work. So that's one of the reasons why Hawk has offered to help. So that's just one other piece. And then, of course, we are always plugging the YouTube channel. If you're watching this, you already know about the YouTube channel. But for our members, we would ask you, if you haven't, to please subscribe. Subscribership gives us a few things, not the least of which is access to better naming conventions, which instead of that really long, ugly link that we have. And that's our housekeeping. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Welcome, Ben. How are you?
I am fantastic. It has been an amazing week in all sorts of ways, and I am really excited to be here.
Oh, I'm excited to have you. So this is kind of one of those things, Ben, that I sort of came around the back of this, right? So I knew of your work. I don't think I've ever talked to you or crossed paths with you up to this point. But certainly there's no way we could avoid all the important things that you're doing, and particularly slaying the dragon. So if you could introduce yourself a little bit in terms of talk about your gaming background, and then let's talk about your book. Let's start with just sort of your gaming background, and then we'll talk about slaying the dragon.
Sure. So I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I still live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There was a good 10 years wandering in there between college and I taught abroad in Egypt, China, and Japan before kind of landing back here. I started gaming, I'm going to say at the age of 12, but I suppose that's debatable. I bought the TSR Marvel Superheroes game.
Ooh,
and I tried running it, and I did a very bad job at the age of 12. It did inspire me to go and buy a bunch of second edition AD&D products. But it should tell you something about me that, oh my God, Michael O'Brien's here?
In a minute.
Okay. I mean, he has to come all the way from Australia. So, should I just keep talking while Michael O'Brien is arriving?
That's fine. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I bought a bunch of AD&D second edition products, although I did not have anyone to play them with. So there was an awful lot of me making Blade Singers and some characters out of the Complete Fighter by Aaron Alston. And D&D and AD&D has almost exclusively existed as literary products for me. Like, I've actually never had a huge, long D&D campaign of any kind. I've played for 3 or 4 months. And again, I've played an awful lot of different kinds of D&D. But then I got to high school and fairly quickly fell into Vampire, Mage, Call of Cthulhu. And I will also confess to playing a lot of Rifts in high school. and I've had a really varied gaming career. Again, I talk to a lot of people who are like, I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons with the same group for like 20 years, but I've had an awful lot of switching of groups and switching of games. So that's a short bio and short gaming bio. Did that adequately answer the question?
Oh yeah, it tells volumes about people, but based on their experience. Certainly mine, yours paralleled mine, which I think I appreciate you admitting that playing when you're younger is a very different experience. I remember coming away from D&D being like, I don't know what this is. This is kind of I think I was introduced at 7. My mom was my DM, and I had no idea what the heck was going on. And I did really want to give it another try, so I came back to it. But it is funny how you know, like you said, playing at 12 is very different from playing, actually knowing the rules essentially. So I appreciate that, and I imagine because of you're so well traveled, that probably influences your gaming group experience too, in terms of just not, it's fabulous if you can play with the same group for 50 years, but I imagine that's not necessarily everybody's situation if you move around a lot.
Yeah, it does blow my mind how many gaming conventions are local and personal and really dependent on the group. And again, I kind of felt like for a few years, I'm like, oh, we in Wisconsin, we've been gaming longer than everyone, so we just do it better. And I just need to teach the benighted masses around the world about the superiority of Wisconsin gaming culture. It's all we have. We have gaming culture. We have the Packers, beer, cheese, bratwurst, and last year we had the Bucks, which was great. But one of the things I really came to realize was, hey, these people who are, like I thought power gamers, for example, were just foolish. And one of the things I came to realize is no, they enjoy their power gaming. It's not that they need to be defeated or instructed or taught. They just enjoy different things. And maybe that works at your table, maybe it doesn't, but they're not fundamentally wrong, which was an arrogance that I had to get smacked out of me over the years.
Yeah, and by the way, they are often in good company, so I always think that's fun too. Where you're like, oh, I thought this was an outlier, and you're like, actually, there's an entire convention of people who think whatever way that's different from your experience, and that's how conventions are made. Actually, it's a bunch of people going, you know what, we all play the same. Let's have more of that. So that's great. So obviously which is I can only imagine your rich background certainly contributes to your perspective both on gaming, its variety. How did you come back to D&D's roots then? Was there a historical interest that piqued for you, or what made you decide to be like, let's talk about TSR and all the fun stuff?
So it somewhat fell into my lap, but it also is a happy coincidence that the material of my book is also about the time that I was I had my peak AD&D interest. I would really struggle to write a lot about, say, 4th edition when I was abroad and paying very little attention, other than to say a lot of people didn't like it, and maybe they're wrong now.
Right.
It seems to be having a brief renaissance.
Uh-huh.
But when I came back to America, I played a Pathfinder for probably 6 months or so. 5th edition came along, and again, the reaction to 5th edition seemed to be, hey, this is pretty good. And by that time, I was, embarking on a career in gaming journalism / history. I teach by day, but that's the sideline. And if you're going to be writing in those waters, if you have a D&D article, typically it just does better. That doesn't mean that other things can't succeed. I always really enjoy writing about Call of Cthulhu, for example. But I think that editors just have an easier time selling. Writers have an easier time selling editors on D&D ideas because editors are confident that millions and millions of people are playing D&D around the world. The number of Wizards throughout last year was 50 million people have played D&D. That was the number and now that's over the course of its lifetime. But I had an email thread with a couple other gaming historians, and I was like, so how many people do you think played D&D before 1999, first 2 editions in OD&D? And we ballparked 2 million-ish people. That means that if our ballpark is correct and Wizards is telling approximately the truth, that D&D is many times exponentially more successful in the past 22 years than it ever was in the 20th century. And again, I still have not fully absorbed the success of D&D. To cite an example, I'm going to keep saying again and again and again, because it blew my 43-year-old white male mind. I walked into the teacher's lounge at the school I teach at, the grade school I teach at, a month or two ago. And in the room, there were 4 women under 30, all discussing their D&D campaigns. One of them a woman of color. And there was no like, hey, my boyfriend got me into it, or I do this because my husband wants to. This was them trading DM notes and talking about how to get people to play their campaigns. And to me, that's an earthquake, because again, when there's never been more people and a wider variety of people interested in Dungeons and Dragons than right now at this moment. So that is really, that reading audience base is really what drove a lot of my work in that field. Did you want me to get more specific about the book, or was that the answer you were kind of looking for?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Which was sort of, I think it is funny, so for those of us who've been fans of gaming, the world's come around to our perspective versus the other way around, right? But it is quite surprising where my son, who grew up with D&D constantly, as you can imagine, it's funny you made the comment earlier, like that's a full D&D. Yeah, my daughter and my son both go, oh, D&D. My dad has like all the stuff. His friends, when my son told his friends, they were like, oh my God, your dad's a DM? Can he run our? And then, I run a Boy Scout troop, and I've hooked into this, that I was like, I need to run for these guys. And the boys absolutely are very excited, but it's just so funny because that's a different, I used to be even afraid to mention it sometimes. And now it's just, people just go, oh yeah, Stranger Things, just pick the pop culture reference. So things have definitely changed. So, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that makes sense, which is right place, right time. Certainly when I wrote my book, it was really much about the video game disconnect between video gaming and tabletop gaming. I don't think that's the case anymore, but there was a real shocking perspective where we had people who I think, and honestly, were working on the D&D video game who'd never played D&D tabletop. And either sort of tangentially mentioned that or admitted that they didn't understand why anybody cared about like rules. Because, my brother's in video game development, and it's always fascinating to me where they talk about like what's the combat rules for when this guy punches this guy, and they're like, we worry about reflex speed, we'll figure out point damage later. And you're like, it just blows my mind to not have a rule system guiding game development first before you go, let's see what the character looks like. But and it's a different perspective, right? It doesn't make it less valid, but that's because there's other factors involved. So right place, right time. So then how did you come to the TSR element, right? So, okay, you've definitely got the background, and you're certainly familiar with it enough. I get where you're coming from, which is maybe D&D wasn't, as you grow, I think this is sort of a mature thing. As you get more mature, your tastes evolve, and you're like, I'm not afraid of my character dying or going insane. Let's play some Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah.
Or World of Darkness, where I'm like, I'm not afraid to tap into some really mature themes that are personal and not have my character only go up in a certain power level. But you came back to TSR. So how did you get there with the book?
So, man, this was 5 years ago now. I was writing for Geek and Sundry back when Geek and Sundry was a real thing. I was not at Geek and Sundry for its true end, but I would be absolutely fascinated, and I have not had a chance to really hobnob with the people that were about it, but I would be fascinated to know what it looked like on the ground, because I want to say the last time I looked at Geek and Sundry, they hadn't posted anything in 2 years. All the content that used to be Geek and Sundry has been slowly migrating over to the Nerdist website. Like, I have things on the Nerdist now, which is a little strange.
Yeah.
But so back when Geek and Sundry was a bit more of a thing, my editor was like, hey, somebody out there should write an article about how Wizards of the Coast didn't always make Dungeons and Dragons, because most people who've played D&D only know it as it's been published by Wizards of the Coast. And a buddy of mine pointed in my direction because I had just done a lot of work on it already. And because I'm in Wisconsin, there's a lot of people still here who worked for TSR and made D&D. So I just had this geographic advantage, and I pounced on it. I started working on the article, and remarkably quickly had interviewed 10 people, one of whom was Lisa Stevens, the CEO of Paizo, the other of whom was Peter Adkison, former CEO of Wizards of the Coast, current owner of Gen Con. And the material I started to get on that story, the story of how TSR failed and was purchased by Wizards of the Coast, was simply things I'd never heard before. Like, I thought I was going to sit down and be like, okay, I know exactly what happened. I was in Wisconsin at the time. I was a teenager paying attention. This was my field. But it turned out that I knew nothing about what had happened at all. So I managed to get one article inflated to 3 articles, which was wonderful, but a lot of work. And even then, when my editor was reading my work, she was like, if you've ever read Geek and Sundry, it has a very peppy, happy house style. And there were things that my editor cut for style reasons that were like factual things. Like, this is just too depressing. We need to rewrite this. This just doesn't fit our house style. And that's when I was like, okay, I need to write some larger work to get this material out there. So even after that, I was like, okay, I'll write a 10, 20,000 word book, just kickstart it, make a couple grand, maybe get the words out there. So I just do research. I interview people, and then I do more research, interview more people. And pretty soon people are sending me things in the mail. They're sending me documents that they've been sitting on for 20, 25 years. Let me show you a historical document, if I may.
Oh, please. This is why we love video. You can show stuff.
This object is Peter Adkison's prep binder from when he purchased TSR.
Wow.
And a TSR employee sat on this for 25 years and then mailed it to me.
Wow.
And that's the kind of thing that I started getting from people. As far as I know, I'm the first person to interview Bob Abramowitz, who was the man who negotiated the first deal to buy TSR. I had to do a background check to find him. I happened to call him up during dinner one day, and I'm just like, hey, I'm a journalist. I'm writing about the deal you negotiated to sell TSR to Wizards of the Coast. Can I talk to you sometime? And in the middle of dinner, he just starts talking for 20 minutes. It's like he'd been waiting years for someone to call him up and ask him about this. And again, then we set up another time to talk in more detail. But the way that so many people were just giving of both information and material, and the fact that, like, I got information in this book that has appeared nowhere else, like actual D&D sales numbers from the company, because people took them home with them and just sat on them and then sent them to me. And again, I don't have everything. But as far as I know, this will be the most complete portrait of TSR, especially in the 90s, that exists. Again, if we're talking about 85 or earlier, I would point you to John Peterson's amazing work, but he and I are fairly complementary. If you read Game Wizards, which is John Peterson's book about the Gygax era at TSR, which came out in October, and then you pick up my book in July, you will have a bit of a 2-volume epic, actually. Like, we didn't coordinate in any way, but it worked out really well that functionally I have written a sequel to his book. Go ahead, Michael. Come again, Michael?
I heard something.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay, Michael. Don't worry about it.
I'm being asked if I wanted a coffee. Sorry, I forgot I hadn't turned mute off. I'll turn it.
It's okay. I was going to ask what time it was in Australia.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, coffee for sure. It's funny. So
it's 9:23 in the morning.
That's not terrible. That's not
reasonably civilized.
Yeah,
I'm turning mute on.
Okay, fair enough.
No problem. That's funny. Yeah. So John Peterson is a CAR-PGA member, and he was on. We had him on a few. Oh God, it wasn't that long ago. But it is fascinating to your point, because he can't cover everything for sure. And the way you put it, I think, is right, which is the time is right. It almost feels like you've been preordained, that like things are coming together where the zeitgeist was ready for this. And I think people were ready to tell it. and right place, right time. So fantastic that you happen to be in and I didn't want to bring up. I was like, oh, is it because you're right there? Was that the obvious reason that the book came about? But it sounds like it was an advantage.
It's an amazing coincidence. Even the order, like, it wouldn't have worked as well if my book came out first and then his book, because again, his chronologically comes first.
Right.
And again, my understanding is, I assume this is public knowledge in some way, but my understanding is that his book sold out its first printing, which again, like, for a D&D history book to sell out its first printing is pretty impressive.
Totally. Yeah. And it was an interesting conversation. I've known John before he was writing some of his first books, and we've talked about, we tried to work together on a documentary that didn't work out, for very TSR-esque, as a matter of fact. But it was just fascinating with the amount of opportunity and interest there is, because I mean, partially because at one point I said, John, like, what happened? Like, all of a sudden there was, like, all this interest. And he said that honestly, the people who know this stuff are passing away. And people are worried that we're going to lose like, and you said, like, there's people out there who think Wizards of the Coast is the only producer of D&D. So yeah, we're now at that generational, cliff where people begin to forget things, or just don't, because of the narrative, it shapes a certain way that we no longer comprehend it. So super excited that you've written this. I have to confess, it's not available yet anyway, right? So I haven't read it. So I haven't seen it.
Nope. It comes out July 19th.
Excellent.
If you pre-order it, you will receive a Jeff Easley bookplate that I will sign, and later on I can share my screen and show you the amazing Jeff Easley bookplate. Jeff Easley, nice. The cover artist of the Dungeon Master's Guide and Player's Handbook. So that is an amazing. If you pre-order it, A, you get a free gift, and B, you get it just sent to you in July. You don't need to hunt it down, right? And you can order it anywhere to get that free gift. Check my social media for what you have to complete after you buy it to get the book plate. But I've now wandered off into a plug. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's part of this, is absolutely plugging this. So now you've got everybody together. You're starting to get surprising resources that are coming to you, which is a gift, right? Because that's always fantastic when you get all this stuff. I've got a perspective from John, certainly, and I've heard it from some other folks, sort of their perspective. I think I've heard from Tim and a few other folks on what they thought went down. But what surprised you, other than the big? I know there's some probably bombshells in there about, was it needlepoint and raising Rex from lakes? But what specifically did you find most surprising in there? Don't give it all away. We got to read it in the book, obviously. But
I will tell you, the thing that I've received the most pushback on is, and again, I don't even know that this is central to my book, because again, I feel like it's mostly about the 90s and Lorraine Williams, the second CEO of TSR.
Right.
But the thing I've already received a lot of pushback on is, I just straight up say, Gygax lied to us about what happened at TSR in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And that's a really hard sentence for a lot of people to hear. And I kind of don't sugarcoat it, because the story he tells is, I went to Hollywood, which was totally unreachable in any way by people in Lake Geneva. And while I was in Hollywood, the Bloom brothers drove the business into the ground and did all of these terrible things. And then one day I found out that they were doing this. So I came back to Lake Geneva and I tried to save everything. As a matter of fact, there was a dramatic meeting where I laid out the malfeasance of the Bloom brothers. And then I dared them to remove. Then the Bloom brothers were essentially removed instead, and I got TSR back, and I was a hero. And that's the story that he tells. But that just ain't the truth. He's in a Wall Street Journal article talking about all these mistakes, like the needlepoint company. In the Wall Street Journal, he justifies that purchase, pointing out that crafts is a larger field than tabletop hobby gaming. He justifies that purchase.
Yeah.
But again, in interviews later in life, he conveniently paints the Bloom brothers, who have not really talked to the media, as far as I know, as both so Machiavellian that he could not trounce them, and so incompetent that they also drove the business into the ground without it being his fault at all. Right. He was just having lunch with Orson Welles and Sid Sheinberg, and there were Playboy bunnies in the tub, and He was a recently divorced Jehovah's Witness. One person said that one eyewitness, I would add, said that when Gygax was in Hollywood, Jehovah was looking in an entirely different direction. And I would tell you that is the thing that I knew that people were going to be kind of resistant to the idea that Uncle Gary was not truthful to us, but there's been that has been the thing that when I've been reading reactions to my book has jumped out at me from people. A lot of a defensive Gygax. And I want to point out that John Peterson also says this in his work. But John Peterson, I'm more Herodotus and he's more Thucydides. If you're familiar with historians, I will get kind of emotional about things and give you my take, whereas he is very much this is what the sources say, this is what the sources say, this is what the sources say, and I'll be the one that comes out and says, yeah, he lied. Those are lies. Then
ipso facto, that's actually a lie if it contradicts what.
But the other thing that surprised me is Lorraine Williams, the woman who essentially took over TSR from Gygax in a hostile takeover, which it was legal, but it probably wasn't right. I honestly think that she comes off better in my work than one would expect. Yes, the failure of the company in 96, 97 is her fault. She has all sorts of flaws. She has all sorts of business mistakes. And yet, she did oversee the creation of things that we are still thankful for today. One of the things I keep coming back to is all those amazing settings. TSR was pumping out just setting after setting after setting after setting in the late 80s and early 90s. You will notice almost no company since then has ever done anything like that. And the reason for that is it probably helped lead to the downfall of the company. Not exclusively. There's a lot of other things going on there. But Lisa Stevens and Ryan Dancy, who were both Wizards employees after the purchase of TSR, Dancy put Stevens, who would later be the CEO of Paizo, in charge of doing the financial autopsy of TSR. And one of the conclusions that she came to was that the launching of setting after setting after setting after setting after setting was cannibalizing their own audience. You might start with Greyhawk fans and Forgotten Realms fans, but by the mid 90s, you are stealing away from, that base Ravenloft fans and then Dark Sun fans. And people got so attached to settings, they wouldn't keep buying the one that they were attached to before. They'd be like, I'm done with Forgotten Realms. It's Ravenloft all the way for me. Which meant that TSR had to make way more product to satisfy the same customer base to generate the same number of sales. Sales were flat at TSR between $30 to $35 million for a while. But what you had was I'm going to speak numbers off the cuff, which is always a little dangerous. I want to say, to give one example, TSR put out 2 setting products in 1984 and had about 250,000 unit sales of those 2 setting products. In 1994, I believe it was, I think I counted, and they put out something 20 or 30 setting products and generated the same number of sales. Here they are doing way more work to generate the same amount of sales. You'll notice Paizo has not done anything like that. They have Galarian, and it's here's all these different kingdoms within Galarian, but it's all Galarian. So you're not going to get divided up into, I like the, I can't think of a single Galarian realm off the top of my head right now, but you don't have that fan base breaking off. You'll notice that until very recently, maybe last week, Wizards of the Coast was pretty hesitant to start making non-Forgotten Realms stuff. There are to this day years where TSR put out more setting product than Wizards of the Coast has in the entire history of 5th edition. There is a real hesitancy to put out that setting product because of one of the lessons being that if you do that, you're cannibalizing your own audience. Furthermore, those of us who were buying TSR products in the 90s will remember so fondly those beautiful box sets that came with all this gorgeous stuff. You may recall the Encyclopedia Magica, which was going to be an encyclopedia of every magic item ever in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. And I want to say it was like $20 with this leatherette cover and a bookmark and gold embossed siding. Mm-hmm. And it sold really, really well. But because they made it so nice, they also set the price point too low and didn't really make any money on the entire line. And it's things like that where like you get good content, you make this amazing product, but like they just priced it too low. There were Dark Sun Adventures with flip books, and TSR lost $1 for every single one of those they sold. They sold hundreds of thousands of copies and didn't notice they were losing money until like the fourth one came out. So it's one of those funny things where like, man, we can wax so poetic about how beautiful and amazing a lot of those products were. And how relatively cheaply they came out. Some of them had CDs, some had VHS tapes. But fundamentally, those products were one of the reasons that the company died. They were losing the company money. Ryan Dancy told me Planescape, for example, was priced in such a way that the entire Planescape line at TSR never made the company any money at all. The breadth of business mismanagement on that hand is quite breathtaking. And yet at the same time, we directly benefited until the death of TSR. We were really getting, cheaper than we should have, beautiful D&D products on a Lorraine Williams discount. And that's why it's complicated, because on the one hand, yes, like these business practices did drive the company into the ground, but, maybe we wouldn't have gotten Spelljammer. Maybe we wouldn't have gotten the Forgotten Realms. Like I want to say at its peak, they had 13 or 14 settings going at once. And there's almost no chance that would have happened with management that was paying a little bit more attention, I'm going to say. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of parallels with what you're talking about in Netflix, which they just, I think there's been a few journalists declaring that the golden age of Netflix funding, whatever it takes to build the next franchise on their streaming platform, just ended because of the massive dip that their stock took in there. But it's sort of an interesting parallel where you have a creative profession where people sort of know there's magic in world building, know they got to fund it, know it's a hungry beast, but don't know how or what success is. So you just fund it all. And of course, by the end of that, for every maybe one or two that makes that works really well, I don't know that's a long-term viable business model. So it's always fascinating to me to see a lot of the parallels I've seen from TSR are repeated mistakes of companies hitting both growth and success, right? So one being a small company in a creative field that's sort of new, not that new, they're still dealing with books and all these other things. And two, growing with a group that doesn't necessarily have the expertise to manage it, right? One of the things that's my favorite is to see Gary Gygax talk about how business and gaming are compatible, even though they didn't have business experience, which is a fun thing. John likes to talk about that a lot of they'll write articles and be like, no, it's just like a game, but it's business. And of course, one of the parallels we see too is WeWork, who had an astronomical rise of billions of dollars and then raised a wreck out of, like Geneva and did needlepoint. By the end of it, they were diversifying so ridiculous. And then sure enough, it accelerated and exploded much faster now. But it's fascinating to see even modern day, as much as I hate to say that, hopefully role-playing game companies aren't committing these mistakes. It seems to be, in creative fields at least, something that they're prone to. So it's really some of this stuff has got to be surprising to folks who, to your point, probably either bought into the mythology or just told stuff that wasn't true because it's not particularly flattering. Or goes against the mythology that was built. Like I said, like saying, any old gamer can become a business person and then be like, well, actually, I made some mistakes. That's a tough pivot to make publicly, especially if you're trying to burnish your reputation, as I can imagine many people wanted to do.
Part of the problem is that TSR did not give sales data to its staff. They might be told in a general way how things were going, but they were not given actual numbers. For example, Zeb Cook, who designed second edition, he was told that second edition did fine, is what he was told. The truth is, second edition never sold as well as first edition, but you could easily argue that first edition was being outsold by basic D&D. Especially like if depending on how you think about numbers and monster manuals, like I want to say it was if you added up all the basic D&D sets sold to the end of the line, and then all the first edition and second edition players handbooks and dungeon masters guides, basic D&D outsold it. Which is, again, not a thing that we would ever think of, right? Because we're like, well, they made AD&D for years and they barely supported D&D. The thing I was told was that they didn't support D&D because when they did, Gygax and Arneson got a cut. When they did AD&D second edition, they didn't anymore. It was one of the reasons probably for second edition was that way you don't need to keep sending Gygax money. And I had marketing guys telling me that they begged Lorraine Williams to buy people like Gygax and Artisan out of their possession of the D&D IP so they could just start making Dungeons and Dragons again. But she resisted giving them any money at all. Hence, AD&D continued, even though one of the marketing guys told me, like, if you remember the older version of the second edition AD&D logo, Advanced was much smaller and harder to see. He did that because he didn't want people to see Advanced. He just wanted them to see Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Can I show you a graph that no one has seen? Can you enable screen sharing?
Yes. Sorry, I forget. I always forget that screen sharing is now not enabled by default. Let me see if I can just multiple participants. Can you do it now?
Let me try. Looks like I can.
Excellent.
All right, share. So this is a chart that appears in my book, and this is based off of TSR sales data on the sales of TSR settings in their first year of release.
Wow.
You will notice that, again, in the beginning with like World of Greyhawk, Oriental Adventures, and the Forgotten Realms box set, like Forgotten Realms there, that looks like a significant dip, but it was released later in the year and it's approaching 100,000 copies. The first Forgotten Realms box set did very well, actually, but just over time, less and less and less. And really, after 1989, after Spelljammer, you just have this like slow descent into the pits. Like Red Steel in 1994 had less than 30,000 unit sales compared to north of 200,000 for Oriental Adventures in 1985. And this is how you get to a place where you're supporting like 13 settings and having to make 13 products to satisfy your customer base, where if you used to only have to make one or two. You'd make Greyhawk, you'd make Forgotten Realms, and again, obviously Dragonlance was a big seller in the 80s too. But again, as far as I know, no one has put out a graph like this before.
That's amazing.
I will stop sharing unless you want to stare at it for a second longer.
No. Well, that's the beauty of recording. We can always pause it. That's great.
You can always go back.
That's fantastic. Thank you for. So, I mean, all right. So you've got a pretty good perspective. I mean, I think you've probably from between hindsight and being a customer, which is always valuable. Sometimes I think it's always fascinating to be like, yeah, I also saw what it was like on the other side, right? So, and now going behind the scenes with folks who were there, could they have saved it? Or was there, one of the things that I think the conversation with John was, there was a lot of fundamental flaws that were sort of small because the company was small. And when it got bigger, those flaws that people didn't talk about or were sort of glossed over, there was nepotism, there was this, there's a lot of things that were sort of endemic to small companies. Look, I've been in small companies. That hasn't changed. Was there a way to save them? Could Lorraine have done it? I don't know who.
Yes.
So Lorraine could have done it.
I'm going to say Lorraine could have done it. I think that that's a great question that no one has ever asked me before. How would you have saved TSR? Part of it, I think, is cultural, because a thing that I was told again and again and again was that people were afraid to tell Lorraine Williams no. She liked yes men. And that is troubling, number one. Yeah. Number two, there was a little bit of how to put this.
Are you trying to be diplomatic now? It's too late. The book's coming out.
No, I'm trying to be comprehensive, actually.
Oh, okay, all right.
Because sales numbers were kept from people, and because, like, if you ask creatives why TSR failed, you'll get 1,000 different reasons. The marketing guys and the business people, they have much different answers than the salespeople. And I wonder how many people, like, I would interview a number of creatives, and at the end they would ask me, why didn't you ask me why TSR failed? And I would say, I wouldn't say this, but I'd be like, you probably don't know.
Right.
Like, one of the highest compliments I got was Peter Adkison listened to one of my seminars, and he's like, I learned things. There were things that I didn't know. And I'm like, that's high praise. Yes. But now I'm prattling on and not answering your question. Because it's a hard one, so I have to think. I think you would have needed Lorraine Williams to. Nope, I'm changing my answer. You couldn't have saved it. I think that the failure of TSR had so much to do with Lorraine Williams's choices and personality that you would have needed someone else in charge of the company to save it. Because if you were able to look at all the problems in one basket, it might have been manageable. But the truth of TSR's situation was kept from the vast majority of people at the company. Because here's the thing. So we've seen those plummeting sales. And we have seen that even if sales are kind of flat because you're making more product, again, sometimes you'll make more product, bring in money, but guess what? You lost $1 per book. That the way that Lorraine Williams papered over all those problems for years was with loans from Random House. TSR had a really unusual arrangement with Random House where they could get loans just by shipping product. And I could talk about that situation for 15 minutes, but I'm just going to summarize here. That combined with the use of something called factoring in the book trade, which prohibited TSR from changing its publishing schedule after January and meant it could not respond with any degree of fleetness to changes in the market, like, say, the launch of Magic the Gathering. You will notice TSR's response to Magic the Gathering had all recycled artwork because they could not get money to put new art on the cards. Because those problems were largely kept within a very small number of people, and because Lorraine Williams was able to use loans from Random House to paper them over those problems in the short term, I just don't know that there was enough information sharing to save TSR. And again, like, even at the end, there was never a moment where she told people, this is why TSR is failing. This is why we're struggling. She told people we needed more money. And then when she fired one person, she did tell that person, we've made mistakes and now we have to pay for them. And that person thought in their heads, you mean you've made mistakes and now I have to pay for them.
Right. Yeah.
But again, even at that moment, she was not telling people what the problem was. They were just like, okay, money's not coming in, like, business is bad, business things are happening. And also, again, they didn't seem to realize what was going on with the atomization of their own market. So I will change my answer. I would have liked to have said that, yes, Lorraine Williams could have saved TSR, but based on what I know of her personality and the fact that she was not sharing knowledge of these problems, I don't think she could have. I think that, frankly, we're lucky that Peter Adkison and Wizards of the Coast bought it, because that's a better fate than probably what would have happened in other circumstances.
Do you explore those circumstances, the potentialities of what could have happened?
Yes, a little bit. So here is another thing that, as far as I know, has not come out anywhere else. And I have to thank historian Michael Kalia for this, because he brought it to my attention. In the spring of 1996, TSR used dozens of their copyrights and trademarks as collateral for a loan to placate Random House. It included things like the Dragonlance setting, the player's handbook, the Planescape setting, the Dungeon Master's Guide. And if TSR had been allowed to go bankrupt, and there was a push within Wizards of the Coast internally, like, why are we paying for this company that's $30 million in debt? Why are we paying anything for this? Why don't we just let it go belly up and then buy it at auction? It's going to be cheaper. But Adkison pushed to not do that because he didn't want employees to flee. He didn't want to lose momentum. But but the unknown threat was the use of that intellectual property as collateral, because if it had gone belly up and had gone to auction, there would have been no reason that person A couldn't have bought the player's handbook, person B buys the Dungeon Master's Guide, person C buys the Forgotten Realms setting, and oh my God, what is going on now? Like, who owns D&D? We don't know. A judge is going to have to figure it out. Like, and it would have, if not killed the hobby, held it back decades, given that D&D is the name brand of tabletop role-playing games. So there certainly was a fate beyond imagining that Adkison and Wizards of the Coast saved us from.
Wow.
Even though, again, my understanding is Adkison did not know. I should just ask him if he knew about that. I don't think he did, because why would Lorraine Williams tell him?
Right. Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I sort of feel like intuitively, certainly everything Ryan has said, they understood the existential threat, but whether or not they knew it was a real threat, right? Which was D&D has to be open. I mean, the open game license, because otherwise there is this constant, it almost died twice, right? So for sure, at least. So that's fantastic. I can't wait to read your book. And I want to be sensitive to your time. I know you've got other stuff to do. So just real quick before we let you go, you have a podcast. So tell us about your podcast so we know where to follow you.
I have a podcast called Plot Points. Now that I have a kid and I have a hard time making time for it, it used to be kind of reviews with some other journalists of games and adventures. It has become me and an academic reading aloud the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, which people seem to love it.
Yeah.
So we're putting out, we I think just recorded our 17th episode of that last night. We're getting at like 2 episodes a month. But again, if you would just kind of want to know what I'm up to, following my podcast is not a bad idea. Again, it's called Plot Points. I'm currently on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Benjamin Riggs on Facebook. I'm at Ben Riggs _ on Twitter. And can I share my screen again?
Oh, by all means.
All right. This, if you were to pre-order my book, Slaying the Dragon, at the outlet of your choice, you get this book plate from Jeff Easley. I will sign it. It's 2 inches by 2 inches when it gets mailed to you. But again, you can see some classic D&D imagery there. I especially enjoyed the wizard using telekinesis to just pull gold out of a treasure chest, and a dragon with a skeleton on it. It's just pretty awesome, kind of metal stuff there. And again, you just get that for free for pre-ordering the book. So I would point you in that direction.
Fantastic.
Pre-order it from after you pre-order it, check my socials, and you will see links where you can put your address in to order that book plate.
And is there a particular place we should pre-order? I mean, I saw it's on Amazon. It's a few places, it looks like.
I would suggest your local bookstore of choice, but again, whatever is easier for you.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you didn't damage your set too much here.
That's fine.
I'll
ask me on any time. I'll come back anytime.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you when the book's actually released. I will publish, we'll have this, and we'll have a note. We'll make sure you send it so you can see it and leverage it as well.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.